The publishing landscape has changed enormously over the past 5 years, 10 years, and especially the last 50. But still, the most common question I get is how to land that coveted book deal. And that's why today I want to simplify the process. I'm going to give you 5 steps to land the deal you want. Stay tuned. Writers often feel called to write a book because they've read something that truly moved, inspired, or changed them. We all feel we have something true to share, but it makes it so intimidating when we're trying to create something that is just as moving and inspiring as that book that changed us. Learning to read like a writer reveals the underlying structure of narrative, showing how and why it speaks to us. It demystifies the process and helps us make decisions for our own work. That's why we started the Page and Podium Book Club. Not just to read lovely memoirs with lovely women, but also to understand how these books work. Each month, we break down a published memoir to see what it's doing under the surface. And your first session is free. Head over to pageandpodium.com/book club to sign up. If you've been watching this channel for long, you know that I do not have any strong blanket feelings about any particular type of publishing. In fact, what I typically tell our authors is that you should publish in the way that feels best for you. The most important part in choosing your publishing path is making sure that that path, 1, serves you, 2, serves your book, and 3, serves your reader. And we can do that through any number of paths to publishing. And yet, a persistent need, especially among the high-achieving women that we serve, tends to be getting that big, glorious book deal. And that's why today I want to talk about exactly how you can do that. Now, before we dive in, I want to give you a couple of clarifications, a couple of caveats that you can keep in mind as we go through today's conversation. Now, the first of these is I want to clarify what exactly I mean when I say book deal in today's conversation. The thing that can get kind of confusing here is that there are several different types of book deals. The first of these would be a small press. Now, with a small press, you still will have a contract issued, and you might or might not have a small advance, although usually I find when people are talking about book deals, they aren't really talking about a small advance. They're talking about something much, much larger. Still, when we think about some of these smaller presses, either independent presses or university presses or a similar scale or size, usually we are talking about a book contract, but that isn't what we mean when we say book deal today. The second thing that sometimes I will hear people refer to as a book deal is signing a contract with a hybrid press. Now, y'all know I love a hybrid press. And I find that very, very often the types of people that I work with really are very, very well served with a hybrid press. But as you'll know from watching this channel, a hybrid book deal is a little bit different than what we think of as a normal book deal. And in fact, there's probably some reasonable debate on whether or not we should call a contract with a hybrid publisher a book deal. I'm really not going to weigh in on that. But I do find that people often, when they sign their contract with that hybrid, which always is going to come with at least a down payment, some kind of payment to the press, it is pretty fun, and I think not totally wrong to call it a book deal. But that's not what we're talking about today either. What I want to focus on today is what I often hear people referring to as a book deal, which would be a Big 5 deal, so a deal with one of the Big 5 New York publishers that usually is going to come with some kind of advance. So as we move through this conversation, kind of keep that in mind. But the second thing I want to clarify before we get into it is that even though that's what we're talking about today, I do not want anyone to come away from this episode feeling like a book deal in that sense is somehow superior to any other form of publishing. In fact, I do not think that. I totally understand why folks want a book deal, and I am in strong, strong support of you if that is what you want. But I do not want anyone to come away from this episode feeling as though the only legitimate way to publish your book is through a Big 5 press. I don't believe that at all. And in fact, if you listen back a couple of months to our episode on vanity presses, you will hear all about my reasoning for why I do not believe for a second that a Big Five book deal is in any way superior to any of your publishing options. And there are 3 reasons for this that I really want to make sure we get laid out before we get started. Now, the first one is a common misconception that I hear all the time, which is that if you want your book to sell, you need to get a traditional book deal with a Big Five publisher. This could not be further from the truth, although I understand where it's coming from. Oftentimes, what I find is that authors assume if they can get one of these Big Five book deals, they will have completely funded marketing and promotion support. This can range anywhere from folks assuming that publishers will be running ads for long-term on either Amazon or any other type of publishing platform. Sometimes people will assume that their press is going to pay for them to go around the country doing a book deal. Sometimes people will assume that the press is going to give you a stipend. None of this is true. In fact, presses do not do long-term active marketing and promotion. Even and especially with the traditional press, the expectation will be that you are out there being the face of your book. Now, of course, this is a little different when we're thinking fiction versus nonfiction, but since we primarily focus on nonfiction, especially memoir on this channel, I do just want to make super clear, if you are publishing with a Big Five publisher, or really any traditional, they are not going to include that marketing and promotion. So what does this mean in terms of misconceptions? Well, oftentimes people assume that the more prestigious your book deal, the more copies you will sell, and the less prestigious, the fewer. This is not true at all. And in fact, there are many self-published authors, particularly those that have some kind of connection to either a business book or a book that kind of builds off their business. In our case, this is often hybrid memoirs meant to establish your credibility, memoirs that are really going to integrate with a speaking career, a coaching career, some other type of business venture. Oftentimes, those books will sell so well, self-published or not. And so typically when an author comes to me with this type of situation, they're writing a book, but they do also want it to be part of a speaking career, a business, something like that, I will almost always suggest that they self-publish. It is much more money in your pocket. And if you already are thinking about how you will market yourself, putting a book in that mix actually is pretty simple. On the other hand, it is kind of a common, I won't say joke, but kind of a common little tongue-in-cheek comment that many times authors will joke about never seeing a dime from their publisher after their advance. And this is so common. The thing to keep in mind, especially about those Big Five traditionals, is that they are operating on a model where they know that a few of the books they acquire will do really well, and others probably won't do well at all. What they're doing is playing a numbers game. They are trying to pull in so many books that the ones that don't sell as well will be offset by those best sellers. And this is why we see so many presses leaning into big established celebrity authors rather than the folks that I tend to work with. It's not because you can't sell well as a non-celebrity. It's because that press is trying to minimize their risk. So when you think about yourself in that mix, I think it becomes pretty clear. That press's priority is probably not gonna be you. If they've got celebrities, if they've got big name people with a lot of visibility, that's really where they're gonna put any kind of their push. You're on your own. And what often happens is that if you get an advance, you are not likely to sell enough copies to get through what that advance payment was. In that case, your royalties are just going to be going into the press, probably in perpetuity. So, what do I mean by that? In sum, when we think about self-publishing, hybrid publishing, publishing with a small press, or publishing with a Big Five, the thing to keep in mind is that there is no clear correlation with the assumed social prestige of your book deal and the number of copies you're going to sell. The two don't correlate. You can self-publish and sell millions of copies, and you can get one of those big 5 book deals and sell 100. It's really not as clear cut as people tend to think. So that's the first caveat that I want to make. The second thing I want to mention and make super sure we're clear on is that oftentimes people will ask me, can I self-publish the book and then use that self-publishing momentum to get a book deal on that same book? And the answer, unfortunately, is probably not. Now, sometimes when I say that to folks, they'll give me an example or 2 or 3 of people who have done this, and there are people like that. I can name a couple in Memoir even. But the point that I want to make is not only is it so uncommon that a self-published author has that same book picked up by a press, but that the reason for that is that a big 5 publisher is only going to pick up your self-published book if it's already selling to the caliber of those sure thing books I mentioned earlier. They aren't going to want it if you need them for something. And often what I find is folks that ask this question want to self-publish because they feel like it will be good enough to get the attention of a big 5 who can then sell the books for them. Well, you already know that isn't how it's going to go. But the other thing I want you to think about is if you are self-publishing and if your book is selling well enough that a big 5 publisher would be interested in reacquiring it, why do you want the big 5 publisher? Now, I know the answer is sometimes the prestige. The answer is sometimes that sense of legitimacy that sometimes comes socially along with a big deal like that. But I would argue that if your purpose is to reach your audience and you are already reaching them through self-publishing, I'm not sure how much a big 5 publisher really has to offer you. My recommendation would almost always be, if your self-published book is doing well enough to attract the attention of a big 5, keep doing what you're doing. There is no reason to change your business model in the middle of selling that book. Just keep doing what you're doing. Keep connecting with your audience. I promise that is going to be the best way forward. But all that said, I am truly not trying to talk you out of aiming for a big 5 book deal. In fact, we help clients get these deals all the time. So if you are interested in a little bit of hands-on support, either coaching or having a done-for-you service, let me know. I would love to support you as you work toward that big, ambitious dream. There's nothing I love more than a big, ambitious dream. And the third thing that I want you to keep in mind as we move through is this question of advances. Now, one thing that I hear so often from authors is that they're hoping to land an advance before the book is written and then use that advance to finish the book. Now, sometimes this is a really good gamble, particularly if you are a verifiable expert, if you have some of the things I'm going to mention as we get into the steps already in place, and if you are somebody who is willing to really wait, give the time, give the effort, energy into making that gamble, this really can pay off. Typically, we're going to recommend this only for prescriptive nonfiction, so meaning non-narrative, not memoir, sorry, but instead the types of books that are instructive types of books. These are still often sold just on a proposal, and sometimes you can get an advance to cover the remaining portion of the writing. However, while it used to be much more common to get an advance of the kind of caliber of the size to cover something like a ghostwriter's fees, really along with the other economic shifts we have seen since 2008 and before that, one of those shifts has really been that advances have gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. And in fact, many books don't get an advance at all. And many that do, it's in the $1,000 to $5,000 range. That really isn't going to take you very far when you think of a ghostwriter, although certainly that can help with some editing. The other issue with this type of thinking, particularly for memoir, is that as you'll hear as we go through these steps, very often memoir or other narrative nonfiction is going to have to be finished before you do your querying. So the idea that you are going to kind of start your memoir, pitch it, get an advance, use that advance to finish writing the memoir, is not something that's likely to happen unless you're a celebrity or something similar to that. So I know that's bad news, but I promise it still can be worth it to aim for that book deal if that's what you really want. Just I would not pin it on the idea of making thousands and thousands of dollars off your advance. That unfortunately is just not something that's very common anymore. Okay, so with those caveats out of the way, let's dive into the 5 steps I promised you to get your book deal. All right, the first step is one that I find surprises people every single time, and that is you must build a platform. Now, one thing that I hear all the time is a lot of confusion about what we mean by platform. We have other episodes in this podcast, whether you're watching on YouTube, listening on a podcast app, or reading along on our blog. We talk about platform building pretty regularly. But the thing that I will say here is when we're talking about building a platform, all we're talking about is building a regular, predictable mechanism for reaching the readers who are likely to buy your books. That's really all we're talking about. Now, sometimes when I talk about platform, people will kind of jump right away to social media. They will assume, well, I need millions of followers on Instagram or TikTok or whatever it might be of that particular moment. And that is actually not true at all. In fact, if you are a live speaker, if you're somebody that speaks a lot, you might be able to use that as your platform, that you are regularly addressing either live or through recorded webinars, that kind of thing, your actual audience. That can often be enough to really get the interest of those big 5 publishers. It might be that you are somebody who has a really thriving business, that you have an expert-based business, people come to you to work on some particular issue, and that issue is what your book's about. That often is going to be enough. Your platform even can be other types of more short form publications, things like articles that you might place in either literary journals or things like Forbes, places where you might be able to reach your audience because they are in touch with that particular venue. Or, of course, it can also be social media. For many people, social media is the easiest way in. I just want to clarify, there are other things you can do here. But the reason that I have got building your platform as the number one thing to do is that one trend that we are really seeing a lot lately is agents who will respond pretty positively to the content in a pitch, but then when they start looking at the author's platform, they realize that they don't actually have a really surefire, repeatable way to reach the actual readers. And since agents know that that is what the big 5 publishers want, they will very often then send that proposal back and say, I would be interested, but you've got to build your platform. So, knowing that if you don't have a robust platform yet, you are very, very likely to hear that from agents, I think we might as well just get started on it right now. Now, one thing that does come up a lot, and we have an episode just a few months back, is that oftentimes people who are writing memoirs, people that tend to listen to this channel, don't feel like they're really experts in anything. There often is this sense that I would build a platform, but I've got to have some kind of verifiable way to show my expertise. And if I'm writing a memoir, one way to do that might be to get a book deal. Oh, I totally get it. It is a really logical way to look at it, actually, except it just doesn't work that way. So how do you build a platform when you know that you've got to build the platform before you get the book deal? Go back and listen to that episode. It's called Promotion When You Don't Feel Like an Expert, because there's lots of tips in there for how you can think about the actual wisdom and knowledge that you are bringing to the table that goes way beyond just your life story. So, suffice it to say, before you can really get started with this process, you are going to have to do at least some of this platform building work. So make sure you have knocked that out. That is step number 1. And yes, this does take some time. It is very likely you are going to need to spend at least 6 months to a year building up this platform so that it has the heft you're going to need to get that attention from the agents, from the big 5, and from your audience. Okay, so that is the first step. The second step that I think is also pretty likely to surprise a lot of people is that you need to write the book. Now, again, I gave a little bit of a caveat on this earlier. Do you need to write the full book before you pitch agents and publishers? The answer is a little bit cloudy, and it depends a lot on the type of book you're writing. So if you are working on a memoir, the answer in 2025 into 2026 is almost certainly yes, you do need to write the whole book. The specific thing about narrative nonfiction, memoir is a part of that general field, is that it sells partly on the writer being a competent writer. That is not simply at the line level, although, yes, also at the line level, but also at the structural level. And unfortunately, without seeing that manuscript, agents and publishers don't know that one, you can do it, and two, you will do it. A lot of people get book contracts and then end up backing out of them. So they really want to make sure that, again, they're minimizing their risk and going forward only with authors they know are going to come through for them. For that reason, if you are working on a narrative nonfiction project, you very, very likely will need to write the whole book before you start pitching. Now, this also can cross over into prescriptive nonfiction. This is things like how-to leadership books, because oftentimes I do find that authors' first book, they're not quite as clear on not only kind of the scope, what they'll be able to cover in the book, but they're also not super sure of what the book itself will actually be until they write it. So if you are in this boat, you are likely going to need to write at least a pretty good portion of your book, if not all of it, before you start pitching. If you are writing, on the other hand, a prescriptive nonfiction, a self-help, leadership, etc., and you are somebody who is very, very competent, very, very able to talk about the scope and scale of your book, how you plan to lay it out, what you think the structure will be, etc., 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 it is actually very possible that you can go ahead and pitch your book without writing the whole thing. But you are going to have to put at least a few sample chapters in there, so you're going to have to get writing no matter what. Unfortunately, we really are not able to pitch a book that doesn't exist at all yet. So be sure that you lock in for that step 2. Go ahead and write the whole book if you can. It really is a better way to move forward. Your pitches are going to be stronger. You're going to be able to see a lot more of the nuance of what you're really trying to do. And very, very likely you'll have a better sense of what the voice is. And you will need the voice for step 3, which is preparing your pitch. Now, I've been calling it a pitch, but really there are 2 components of any pitch to literary agents, which is going to go to your big 5 publishers. The first thing is that you're going to need your book proposal. Now, this is what I find that a lot of people have a lot of misconceptions about. And it also is something that I'm hearing a lot of people go to ChatGPT for. So we'll see how that shakes out. But the book proposal is a very, very, very important portion of your pitch. And I cannot recommend strongly enough that you do not have ChatGPT or any other generative AI do your book proposal for you. All right, that said, let's dive into what we mean by a book proposal. Now, sometimes I will hear people say that they're working on their book proposal and they'll use the term one-pager and they'll use that term interchangeably with the term book proposal. This is not a true equivalence. In fact, often book proposals, especially once you get those sample chapters in there, can be upwards of 100 pages. A book proposal is not a small thing. Instead, with the book proposal, we have usually 7, 8, 9 set components that will appear in your proposal. These are going to be things like your comps, meaning your comparative or competing titles. Those are books that have come out usually in the last couple of years. Sometimes they're books that have just been announced but not released yet. And they are books that should show your agent that, number one, there is already an established audience for your book, as evidenced by how well these books have done. And there is something missing from these books that you are going to add. So we have both, my book is like other books that are successful, and my book is different from other books that are successful. You will always have a comps section in your proposal, and often in your query letter, which I'll get to in a second. Comps are so crucial. You will also have some kind of description of the audience and or the market, meaning both the readers and the classifications that the industry will use to put that book on the shelf in the appropriate place. You'll also have things like a detailed outline. I mentioned your sample chapters already. You'll have some of the just kind of specifics of your book in there at some point. and a few other parts that you can or cannot include depending on your type of book and what's going to serve it the best. But suffice it to say, a book proposal is a true formal document. It is not something that you can put together quickly, and it is often not something that you can put together on your own, although mileage may vary. But this is something that we will often get inquiries for at Page and Podium. We are happy to either ghostwrite your book proposal for you or coach you through the process. We love to see authors aiming for these big, ambitious goals, and we want to make sure that you're the best prepared you can be to actually achieve that goal. So, the book proposal can be a pretty challenging document, and it's only one of the two. The second component that you are going to need in this pitch process is your query letter. Now, while the book proposal is challenging because it is such a thorough document, the query letter is challenging because it is such a brief document. In fact, you are typically aiming for only around 300 words or less. It's about a single double-spaced page when you are putting your query letter together. Now, let me talk a little bit about the purpose of the query letter, because I think that's a much, much easier way to get at what we're doing here than trying to describe the components. When we think about the process of moving through your pitch, this third step that we're talking about here, you'll go through a series of steps that are pretty much the same no matter what your book is. The first thing is you will send the query letter out. The purpose here of the query letter is just simply to get that agent to request more information. Now, you might have guessed, more information is the book proposal. And the reason that we already wrote it is because we want to make sure when that agent replies and says, "Oh, this is interesting. Do you have a proposal?" that we can reply right away and say, "Yes, I do. It's attached." Oh, it's dreamy. We love it. At that point, then, your agent will review that proposal, decide whether they want to take you on as a client. Typically, you will have at least one Zoom or phone call to talk with the agent, get a sense of whether you get along, give them a sense of kind of how you will be to work with, and for you to learn more about the way that the agent plans to work, what their rates are, usually about 10%, that kind of thing. So from that point, if they decide to sign you on as a client, they will then take your proposal with or without revisions made by you, them, or both, and then they will take it what's called on sub. So we're going to get to that in a second, but suffice it to say, the book proposal and the query letter work together simply to get that agent interested in what you're doing. So the query letter, the whole purpose is just to get their attention and ask them for more information. Now, query letters have a very clearly established format, and one really good thing about query letters is that they don't differ as much from fiction to nonfiction as some components of book writing. So, you should be able to Google this. There's tons of great information on how to write a strong query letter. I typically recommend that you have a quick description of the book. You can include some comps. You should definitely talk about your particular expertise, the reason that you are the person to write the book, although that's quite brief. And of course, with any document of this sort of genre, we are going to need a pretty strong hook. So if you've got those components there, you've got to start. But usually that query letter is kind of a growing, living, breathing document. As you are sending it to various agents, you're going to get some kind of feedback. Usually that's just no's. And from there, you'll be adjusting that query letter to make sure it's as strong as possible until, hopefully, you do start to get some regular inquiries from folks asking you to see your proposal, and eventually, we hope, asking to see the full manuscript, have a call, and sign a contract. So this is why the third step is you've got to get that proposal and your query letter together. And from here, it's pretty smooth sailing. I already teased both of these last two steps. The fourth step is you will query. Now, I do want to give you a couple of tips for this querying process because it can be quite stressful. And if we want to make this as smooth and easy and efficient as possible, and of course we do, we might as well go into it with a plan. So there's a few things that I want to suggest you do as you go through this querying process. The first thing I want to suggest you do is that you think of your queries in batches. One very, very common thing that people will do, highly recommend it, is scrape the internet, find those agents you want. Now, there's lots of databases for this. We use Publishers Marketplace primarily. That is a paid service, but you also can look at Query Tracker, Agent Query, tons of these on the internet. People will find a list of agents. You'll need to research them a bit. It always is best practice to put a little bit of personalization into your query letter just to show you know who that agent is. But as you are researching those agents, you will inevitably come up with some that are your top choice, some that are kind of contingency, and some that are right in the middle. When you do that, we highly suggest breaking these into A, B, and C lists. A being the ones that are the dreamiest dream agents, C being agents you'd be fine with, but they're maybe not your top pick right now. Things could change. And when you put that together, we suggest querying in batches. Now, rather than sending all your A's out, then all your B's out, then all your C's out, what we suggest is you send a couple of A's, a couple of B's, and a couple of C's. The reason for this is, as I mentioned earlier, your query letter is a living, breathing document. It will have to change, take different shapes, mold, form, depending on what you're hearing back from agents. So, if you send that first round to all of your A-list agents, well now, if they all got rejected because you need to revise your query letter, your A-list people are already gone. At the same time, if your query letter hits on the first try, well, we don't want it to only go out to the C-level agents, right? Because now you're going to have to decide whether you want to hold out and try for the A-level ones. So the best practice is to do a couple A-list, a couple B-list, a couple C-list, rinse and repeat until you have got that agent. The second tip I want to give you is to put a time-bound bracket on your querying practice. One of the things that is really, really tough, actually difficult to overstate how tough this is that the querying process is mostly just waiting. Once you've done all that agent research, once you've got your query letter together, you are mostly sending the query out and then waiting the 6 to 8 weeks to see if the agent gets back to you. Unfortunately, in this world, agents are just really overwhelmed. Very, very often it will take that full 6 to 8 weeks to hear back. And unfortunately, one of the most common ways agents will tell you no is just by not replying. That means that you are very often sending these query letters out and feeling as though you are sending them into the void. Ugh, this is not a fun place to be at all. So, what I recommend is that you really sit with yourself and think about, how long are you willing to aim for this book deal? Are you willing to wait a year to see if in that querying span of a year, if you do not have an agent, will you call it good? Do you want to wait 3 years? Do you want to wait 3 months? How long are you willing to wait? Recognizing that each of these rounds is likely to take that full 6 to 8 weeks. So, as you are sitting in those query trenches, as we often call them, I want you to give yourself kind of a bracket. At what point will you say, you know what, this isn't working for me, I'm gonna find a different route? At what point will you go ahead and say, let's look at the other options that I might have? Having that date really clear in your mind can really help those query trenches feel a little bit like endless shouting into the void because you have an end date for that. So highly, highly recommend that you are thinking about time bounding that querying trench place, just because it can be really lonely. And the other tip I want to share is that as you are querying, one thing that seasoned authors will typically do is once they start querying, once they've got that proposal together, they've got that query letter together, and their book is done, they will move to a new project. Sometimes the only way to get through it is to distract yourself. And this is why starting on a new project can actually be the very, very best thing for you as you are waiting for those queries to come in. So that will be the next stage. The fourth stage will be this querying process. And as I mentioned earlier, the goal, the best case scenario, is that the right agent will see your query letter. They will reach out and ask to see your proposal. Typically from there, they'll ask to see the whole manuscript, or if it's prescriptive nonfiction, sometimes we won't have that stage. Typically with memoir, we will, though. They will ask to see your full manuscript. Hopefully, they will schedule that call. We call it the call, to see if you're a good fit. You'll sign on with them. And then step 5, the good news is you don't have to do much at all. In step 5, your agent will take your manuscript what's called on sub, meaning they are submitting on sub that proposal to various editors that they know in those big 5 houses, and sometimes non-big 5 houses. Sometimes they are also working with those smaller independents. But either way, they are taking that proposal on sub, trying to get you a contract. And then what we hope is that you do land that book deal, you sign on with the editor, everything else goes according to plan, and you have achieved that big, ambitious goal. Yay, we love it. Okay, so I know I promised 5 steps here, and I gave you 5 steps, but what I did not promise was 5 simple steps. These are not simple, and they're not easy. They are really, really challenging things to do, and that's why getting that big book deal is such an accomplishment. And with that, I want to emphasize once again, none of these publishing options is inherently better than any of the other. None of these publishing options inherently guarantees you better sales. None of them get you off the hook for marketing and promotion. If you want that big 5 book deal, I want you to go for it, because there is nothing worse than wondering what would have happened if you actually tried. But what I do not want you to do is pin your book's legitimacy and your own legitimacy on whether or not you get that deal. Those things are not correlated, and neither are your sales with your type of publisher. Any type of route you go, you can reach your audience, you can have a successful book, and you can feel really, really good about it. So, as you're moving forward, whatever path you choose to follow, let us know if we can help. Page and Podium has always been supportive of every single type of author, from those who want big book deals to those who self-publish, and everything in between. Come see us. We would love to support you. In the meantime, please like, rate, share, subscribe, leave us a review, and otherwise, happy writing. You've been writing your memoir, maybe even for years. You know your material, you know what it means. What's missing isn't the story, it's the structure. And that's why we started the Memoir Method Book Club. Every single month, Emily Thrash, a professional writer and editor, teaches you how to read like a writer by breaking down a published memoir and showing you what it's doing under the surface. Your first session is free. Head over to pageandpodium.com/book club to sign up.